Welcome to the EntrePastors podcast on YouTube. This is a show that helps pastors think, act, and thrive as prosperous entrepreneurs. Well, hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome to the EntrePastors podcast on YouTube. My name is Jon Sanders. I'm one of the co-hosts of the show. And man, have we got an awesome conversation lined up for you today. You are going to meet a guest by the name of Kent Sanders. And Kent has taken a journey from being a pastor in full-time ministry to now he works completely full-time as a ghostwriter. And you're going to hear us in this conversation talk about how ghostwriting is really a great option for many pastors. Like we believe many pastors already have so much of the skill set necessary to be successful in that business of ghostwriting, and it can be a super lucrative form of income that can be flexible to your schedule and really utilize a skill set that you already have. So you're in for a really good one. If you have any interest whatsoever in writing, if you've ever wanted to write a book or have any experience doing something like that, you're going to want to lean in and listen to this conversation that my co-host Les Hughes and I had recently with Kent Sanders on his journey from being a pastor to a ghostwriter. So without any further ado, let's cut to this interview with Kent Sanders. Check this out.
Kent Sanders, welcome to the EntrePastors podcast, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing great, and I appreciate you guys having me on to the legendary EntrePastors podcast, the show that I have heard about and seen all over the internet for quite a while now. So
oh my
it's
goodness.
an honor to be on.
From your lips to God's ears, man. May it be so. That would be awesome. Well, man, Jon and I have been looking forward to our conversation with you today. So if we could, let's just start out by hearing what your world is like today. I know that there's been a lot of transitioning in years past. We'll get to that, but I'd really like for our listeners to hear about what your life is like right now, because there is some ministry and some church-related vocational things involved there too. But I want us to start with where you are now, and then we'll reverse engineer things and look back a little bit.
Sure, that sounds fantastic. Well, where my world is right now is, I would say 75 to 80% of my job is being a full-time ghostwriter. Actually, that phrase makes no sense at all now that I think about what I just said. But anyway, this isn't a mathematics podcast. This is an EntrePastors podcast.
That's right.
So yeah, primarily I'm a full-time ghostwriter. What that means is I write books for leaders, entrepreneurs, and people who want to tell their story. And that can take the shape of a memoir type of a project. That can be a straight up nonfiction kind of a book. It can really be a different range of things, but that's what I primarily spend most of my time doing. The other, I would say 20% of my job is I run a daily podcast called The Daily Writer. And I also run a membership community called the Daily Writer Community. And I really love that side of what I do because I get to filter into and encourage and help teach and train writers for their own books. And some of those people are doing client work like I am as well. It's kind of like what they say about pastors, once a pastor, always a pastor. And I would say once a teacher, always a teacher. And I've done both of those roles. And I have a strong impulse to help teach others the things that I have learned and I'm still learning every day. So I love being able to not just do client work, but also use that teaching and pastoral part of myself to filter into the community. So primarily my whole life is about books vocationally. And I spend all my days thinking about books, writing books, editing books, and whatever's related to books. That's pretty much what I do. So,
and yeah. I don't know that there's any percentage associated with this, but I'd say the vast majority of pastors are readers. Many of them are writers. More and more. I mean, they have to be readers regarding not only theology and sermon preparation, but also leadership and management and navigating change. I mean, we're constant learners. Many pastors or people with ministry backgrounds have a spiritual gift of knowledge.
Yes.
Or a spiritual gift of teaching, which is why we are sponges. And one of the reasons that we really have been looking forward to having this conversation is that, I'm have been introduced to the ghostwriting world myself. So I'm a more recent convert, but am seeing some success in that world. And I have been pleasantly surprised, and I guess really almost shocked, Kent, that this world is just now becoming apparent to me, because I've personally known ghostwriters in the past. I mean, prolific ones. And I've known one particular ghostwriter that was a mentor of mine, 15 years ago. But I never just considered that as a potential revenue source, significant revenue source for me. It just wasn't in my world, but it is now. And so I know that there are people that are out there that are a part of our tribe, part of the group that we're talking about. And because maybe communicating comes I'll say easily, naturally to many of them, they take for granted that it's just that way for everybody, and it is not. And there are many people. So if you would speak to the fact that there are so many people that have a message that they want to get out, but because of the nature of the beast, they certainly don't have time to, sit in the chair and crank it out, or to do so would take away from them being on stages or doing the work that really brings in revenue into their own world. And and they wouldn't be a very good writer on top of it. So the product is better. They can do it more quickly, and they can continue doing the thing that they really need to be doing, kind of their zone of genius, and then pay you or someone like you to actually produce the book. It's still their content. It's still their material, but it's just what you do or what a ghostwriter does. So speak to that if you would.
Sure. Well, you've really hit the nail on the head. There are people out there who, I guess just to speak it really plainly, there are a lot of people out there who have more money than time. And those are the people who really, I think as a ghostwriter, I'm looking to serve. It's people who have the income that they want to spend on hiring a professional ghostwriter to put together a book for them, but they don't have the time or the inclination to do it. They don't enjoy writing. Maybe they don't have the talent for writing. They don't really think in terms of having to sit down and spend, a couple hundred hours organizing and writing a book and crafting it and doing interviews and all those kinds of things. A lot of pastors, that kind of stuff comes very naturally to us. We went to school for that. Many of us, from the time we were little kids, we loved being in books and in content and in sermons and preaching and lessons and all that stuff. But there are a lot of people out there, particularly in the business community, who that's not something they enjoy or are particularly good at. And they are happy to pay somebody to sit down and help extract knowledge and wisdom and insights and stories from their life, bake that into a really well-crafted book so that they can get their message out there. And I tell people all the time, particularly prospective clients, why should you spend all your time writing a book when you've got way more important things to do? You've got your own clients you need to connect with. You need to be out there marketing. If you're a CEO or a CFO or a C whatever, you're in charge of some really important things. And many of those people are over tons of people. They have big budget companies they're running or divisions. The last thing they need to be spending their time doing is sitting down and trying to suffer through putting together this book when they're not really gifted with that. They have no desire to do it. So that's where people like us, like ghostwriters, come in, where we can take those stories and knowledge and wisdom, and we can relatively quickly think about those things and figure out a way to organize it and position it to help that person get more of what they want in their business or their life or whatever the goal of the project is. So there does kind of exist this, among writers, there exists kind of this surprise that not everybody enjoys writing. But, writing is the same thing as anything else. Not everybody likes it or is good at it or enjoys it. I'm not a particular big sports person. My brother, on the other hand, is a huge sports person. He goes to tons of St. Louis Cardinals games. He knows all the players. Recently we had, and I'm going to show my ignorance here. I'm sure you guys probably know this. There was a player who recently came back to the Cardinals. What was his name? Was it Molina or was it?
I don't even know. More than me, man.
I don't even know who it was.
I don't know.
It was a guy who used to play for the Cardinals. He came back to St. Louis after like 10 years being gone. everybody in St. Louis is going nuts. And I was like, oh, I didn't even realize he left. I just don't pay attention to that.
Right.
But in the writing world, it's the same way.
Mm.
Not everybody is into writing. And there are a lot of people out there who are thrilled to pay a writer to come in and do the work that they need to have done, but they're going to do it a lot faster and a lot more efficiently.
Yeah. And do you think it's fair to say, or it's accurate to say, that most people in the public would be surprised to find out how many books actually have a ghostwriter behind them?
Yes, that's true. And Les, I'm sure you're the same way. I have this conversation sometimes multiple times per week with people, because as soon as you throw the word ghostwriter out there, people are always intrigued by it. They're interested in what it means. And they're shocked to learn that not everybody writes their own book. Mm-hmm. And I'd always kind of crack up at that, because I didn't know either until I got into this world. But it's true. Nobody knows the real number. I've seen different stats, but none of them can possibly be accurate, because by definition, what we do is kind of a hidden thing.
Right.
But I would venture to say a pretty large chunk of books, even a lot of fiction books, are ghostwritten. Yeah.
Yeah. Not a lot of people know this about me, Kent, but I have a pen name. It's Rick Warren. So I've written a few things. Don't tell anybody that, okay? I need
we'll edit that out.
Yeah.
My question is, where do you keep all your money from those book royalties?
That I can't tell you. So, no, hey, this is awesome. I want to keep talking about ghostwriting, but if I can, I want to back up just a minute, Kent, in your story, because I'd like to hear a little bit of your journey into pastoral ministry, and then maybe out of many in our audience have a foot in both worlds. They serve as pastors and entrepreneurs or business owners of some sort. We have others in our community that have made that same transition or desire to make that same transition completely out of pastoral ministry and fully into that. So I'd just like to hear a little bit of your story. What did that look like for you?
So when I was a kid, I always assumed that I would be a pastor. I never, for a second, up until I went to college, really, I never considered doing anything else. I thought I was going to be a preaching pastor because I came from a small church in southern Missouri. The only pastor that I knew of, the only kind of pastor, was a preacher. Our church just had one preacher. So I just assumed that's what I was going to go do. I felt a very deep and distinct calling to go do that. Went to college to go do that. I found out that I was decent at preaching, but I didn't particularly enjoy it. But then I got involved in music in college quite heavily. And so instead of being a preaching pastor, I actually went to be a worship pastor at a church in Northern Illinois. Did that until I was about 29. I loved it. I found out I had a real gifting in that area. And then I went to teach that same area, worship and music ministry, at the college level in St. Louis, where I had gone to school previously, and did that job for about 10 years and got really, I would say, really burned out on that. And sometimes I tell people, there's a reason why in many churches that have modern music, where you have a lot of media stuff going on, you have a worship band, you have all kinds of production things happening. There's oftentimes a reason why you don't see worship leaders who are older than like 37 or 38. And one of those reasons is that it is a really tough job emotionally. It's very tiring and exhausting to be involved in that on a weekly basis. Anybody who's listening to this right now who's involved in worship and music ministry at their church will know exactly what I'm talking about, because you're basically creating a production every single week, sometimes multiple times a week if you have more than one service. So I found that I just got really burnt out on that. As much as I, of course, love Jesus, love God, and it was not a spiritual thing. I was just tired of doing that job. Fortunately, the school where I was teaching allowed me to transition out of that into more of a teaching role that had to do with communications and writing and teaching courses on storytelling and film and some things like that. And so I switched into that role. And around the same time, I really kind of looked around at the higher education landscape, and I looked around at our college, and our enrollment wasn't growing. In fact, it was going the opposite direction. And I knew that I really needed to kind of figure out what my next step was going to be, whatever that was going to consist of. So I looked around at my options, and at that time, I began to listen to podcasts by guys like Dan Miller, who has been so influential on so many other people as well, with his 48 Days to the Work You Love book and many other things. I began to read books by people like Jeff Goins, and I listened to podcasts by a guy named Cliff Ravenscraft, the podcast Answer Man. and all those kinds of people, and really became inspired by that. And I began to see that I could potentially create my own business if I could figure out what I wanted to do and how I would go about it. So I just started doing that, going to conferences, reading books about those kinds of things, and doing some freelance work. And my very first freelance job was writing podcast show notes for a client. And I found out that I really liked it. And it was really cool getting paid to do that, even though it wasn't very much money. I thought, wow, this is kind of cool because you can create your own thing on the side, just like Dan Miller had been talking about all this time. And really, it just kind of built up from there. And about 3 years ago, came across some material by a guy named Nick Pavlidis. And he was talking about how ghostwriting can change your life. And I took his course and just did what he said and started telling people I was building a ghostwriting business. And then it just kind of grew from there. Now, one thing I do want to add in there, because all this sounds like it may have been sort of planned out and everything, but it really wasn't. I kind of just stumbled into this, to be totally honest with you. But I did find that all the things that I had been doing all along, like writing my own books, like doing a podcast, networking and connecting with people, all those things really were helpful when it came time to focus on building a ghostwriting business specifically. Because ghostwriting isn't just necessarily typing words and giving a Word document back to the client. There's a lot of networking involved with it. There's a lot of listening skills that are involved in it, a lot of knowing how to structure a book and all those kinds of things. So I found out that all the things that I had as my background as being a pastor and a college professor, as well as the things that I was doing like freelance writing and podcasting and writing my own stuff, all those things really came in handy when it came time to build a ghostwriting business. So it was kind of an intentional journey. I'm really thankful for ghostwriting because that allowed me to really focus in on one specific kind of service for clients and allowed me to build a full-time business around that. But I did make a lot of mistakes along the way, and I had a lot of help from a lot of people. So yeah, there was a lot of twists and turns for sure.
I want to go back just another quick second, and have you speak to this. So you grew up in a traditional small church setting. You had really just one picture in your mind of what it meant or looked like to be a pastor, and you went into that. So I'm curious, was there any like mindset stuff that you had to wrestle through when you were at that point of just being worn out, ready for a new season? To your point about the worship leaders that you never see them, rarely see the older ones. I always just thought that was because the skinny jeans didn't really work on that generation.
That's part of it.
But no, seriously. Yeah, when you're at that point of, and I've been there, like I've been there, done that. That's part of my story too, of just being emotionally exhausted in the ministry and not tired of it necessarily, but just ready for something new.
Right.
But did you have to work through any kind of mindset stuff or limiting beliefs that said, man, you can't do this, you can't quit the ministry?
Every day. I mean, radically, I had to work through it. It's something I still wrestle with, to be honest with you, because once you're in the church/ministry world there, and I think and this is so much fun being on this podcast because your listeners understand this on a level that most other people don't, because you're in this world all the time. Is that when you're in the church world, there's kind of an unspoken message that you should never make too much money, and that you really shouldn't have anything kind of beyond sort of a living wage, and people who make more money than that or aspire to build something bigger than working for an employer or working for church, that's kind of bad. And many times in the church world, there's kind of this like collective agreement that none of us are really going to try very hard. Yeah. We're all going to just kind of be content with whatever life gives us. And there kind of came a point where I just sort of got tired of that, to be honest with you. And I became frustrated by that. Yeah. And then I saw people over here like Dan Miller, going back to him, that looked at what he did very much as a ministry, and he was doing very well financially, and he gave a lot of money away and was very generous. And I was like, man, maybe there's a different way to kind of approach this whole ministry thing. Yes. That allowed me to have a better financial future for my family, to have more financial security, but that also was a way that I could serve people and talk to people about Jesus and have spiritual conversations. And I've been really surprised to learn in the past couple of years, as I have done various book projects, that I've had more conversations about spiritual matters the last couple of years, probably than I have the previous 20 years, because I've been way more out and about and kind of like the general public and the business world and so forth. That has been really, really surprising to me, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it.
I heard somebody say one time, it's sort of like being salt and light.
Exactly.
Yeah. How about that? All right. Go back then, if you would, to those times that you were making that transition. So we're talking about what you said, 3 years, right? I mean,
Something like that. Yeah.
yeah, where you really were intentional about it and said,
Right.
all right, this is going to go. So how did that look? Because we're talking to some people they're like ready to make something happen. They're action
Right.
takers. They just don't want to get out there and they don't mind taking a leap of faith, but they don't want to jump off a cliff either. You know what I mean? Without a net. So how did you kind of build that off ramp? And I would suspect that there was a transitional time there. So how did you balance all of that? What kind of rhythm was there to your week? And I'd just be curious even to hear a little bit about maybe a current rhythm to your week, because I know there's a lot of things that you do and how you block out that time, to kind of work on your craft now. So how did you, when you were, you didn't come from, when you were at the university, at the college, were you also serving a church at that time, or were you a full-time professor?
No, as a full-time professor. There were a few stints in there during my teaching career where I did part-time ministries at churches. And I always really enjoyed those.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, part of the reason why I enjoyed them, I probably shouldn't say this on this podcast, but one of the reasons that I enjoyed those part-time ministries was I could go in and kind of do my thing, and then I could be done for the week.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't like I was there at the church every day. There was something to me that was really fun about, hey, I've got this really specific thing I've got to go in, and maybe it's leading worship. Okay. Yeah. So I'll plan the worship for like, a month at a time, and then I go in and do it. And then I'm kind of done. And I really kind of enjoyed that. There was something really fun about just like being an interim pastor or a part-time pastor or something.
So how long did it take you then? I kind of know the answer to this, which is why I'm asking, but not specifically like to the day. So how long did it actually take you to replace that? I'm sure humongous, like gaudy salary that you were making at a Christian college level.
It was vast. It was vastly huge.
Of course.
No, of course it wasn't. So, well, the way that I approached this was I approached this in a very systematic way. So one thing that was really important to me is if I was going to make a transition away from that job into having my own business, it was very important that my wife feel comfortable with this. And of course, anybody who's married understands that dynamic. You want your spouse to feel comfortable and supported and financially secure. So really, I had two criteria. Well, actually three. So the first thing in the criteria was my wife had to be okay with when I was going to leave, and with whatever our state was financially or security wise or whatever, she had to give me the thumbs up. That was priority number one. Second of all, when I left my job, we had to follow in my own mind, I wanted to make sure and follow the Dave Ramsey thing, which is have 3 to 6 months of expenses saved up, which we did. Mm-hmm. So that was criteria number two. And then number three was that I had to be making, again, this is my own rule, is that I had to be making at least as much as I was making in my college job in my side business for me to be able to step down. And I had to be doing that for 6 months consistently. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, and my wife agreed with all this, if I'd been matching my college salary for 6 months and we had another 3 to 6 months saved up, then that was kind of a proof of concept that this was a viable thing and that I had enough regular client work to keep us going. And I feel very comfortable with that. So that's exactly how I approached it, honestly. Because to me, if those things were true, then that meant I did have a viable business. So there was really no leap of faith about it, other than just faith that it would continue. Mm-hmm. I'm kind of a detailed, systematic, kind of a logical, rational type of a person. So I didn't want any surprises. I didn't want to be one of those people who quits their job and then they look around the next day and go, okay, what now, Lord? Yeah. I mean, I have faith, but I think a lot of times and this is just my opinion, of course, but I think a lot of times we kind of misunderstand the idea of faith in the sense of, to me, faith is not necessarily about doing something stupid and hoping God rescues you. I think to me, faith is understanding that, okay, God has given me intelligence. He's given people around me intelligence. He's given me mentors and a wife who's really smart. And faith is trusting that those people have input and insight into my life too. So if these are the people in my life, trust that I'm making a good decision. If my client load, if those people trust that I'm providing them a service that's worth paying for, if my spouse trusts in this process, then I think we're going to be okay. So there's an element to this where, yeah, there obviously is faith, but to me, it doesn't necessarily mean you just take a complete leap of faith without any evidence that something is going to be there.
Yeah. Well, and you've mentioned that, what you do takes time.
It does take time.
So how did you fit that into the margins when you still had probably a growing family and, a demanding career and, life was happening. So how did you do that instead of procrastinating until the time was there, because it's never really there?
Well, that's a good question. So I did a podcast episode on my show. This has been probably 6 or 8 months ago. And I titled it a 10-year overnight success. And I titled it, and I just had like an hour-long episode about this. I don't usually do long sort of solo episodes a lot of the times, but I wanted to talk about on that episode how a lot of people have been intrigued by my transition the last year or two from being a college professor to a ghostwriter. But I think what to me was really more interesting is that, back in, I'm just going to pull a year out of my hat. Back in 2015, when I was up till 1 or 2 a.m. producing a podcast or doing client work or writing show notes or blogging or, replying to emails, helping people with their writing stuff. Whenever I was doing those things, nobody was really intrigued by it because it wasn't that exciting. But it was those things and that consistent work for years. Really, it started back in 2012. And I went back 10 years because that's when I went to a conference called Right to the Bank that was put on by Dan Miller. That really got this whole thing kind of started. Mm-hmm. So the way that I fit it into the margins is I just fit it in. I would stay up late. I would get up early. I would use breaks sometimes in my college day to do things here and there to write. Now, one thing that was unique to my situation, which I know not everybody will have this opportunity, but I also used my college courses to help me learn skills that I knew would come in handy in business. For example, I would oftentimes pitch courses to our academic dean on writing or storytelling or film or, I did a course called Writing for Publication. I did a course on that was called Communication Technology for Ministry, where I was basically taking all the things I was learning about podcasting and media and writing, and I wanted to frame that for our college students who were preparing for ministry to help them learn some of these things too. So I tried to really use my college. I never took advantage of anything. I never felt like I was doing that, but yeah. I thought, well, if I could somehow merge these two things in some form or fashion, that would be pretty cool. So I tried to position things in my day job to where I was learning and integrating the things where I was doing my side business. Mm-hmm. And I know not everybody can do that, but I think in a church ministry kind of situation, there's a lot of cool things that you can do to use the skills that you're learning in your side business and use those in a ministry situation and vice versa.
No doubt.
I don't think necessarily, I'm not saying, the two are not the same thing. I'm not saying that, but I do think there can be some overlap if you want there to be, depending on the situation, of course.
Kent, I totally agree with that. That's one of the messages that we proclaim often here at EntrePastors is that pastors, by the very nature of the work of what pastoring is, have a skill set that can take them in a lot of different directions.
Oh my gosh.
Out in the marketplace. And it's
Absolutely.
Also one of the biggest limiting beliefs that many pastors have when they think about thriving financially out in the marketplace, that, there's this limiting belief that rises up saying, well, what would I do? I'm just a pastor, So speak to that. What would you say to that pastor that's wrestling with that belief right now?
Well, so I would say two things. Number one is I would say every job is basically the same. Now, is the guy who's driving a Caterpillar tractor or whatever on a job site, on a job construction site, is that the same job as being a therapist in an office? No, but it is the same job in terms of you are trying to help somebody with a problem that they have. You're trying to problem solve. Every job is ultimately about problem solving. And pastors are exceptional at problem solving. I mean, think about all the fires and problems that you have to deal with on a weekly basis. You're doing counseling, you're planning services, you're putting together messages, you're teaching, you're visiting people, you're doing hospital calling, you're dealing with staff issues, you're going to board meetings, you're dealing with the cranky elder or the cranky person who doesn't like the drums or whatever it is. I mean, I can't think of any other job, maybe except for the president of the United States, who deals with such a wide variety of problems on a daily basis. So all those skills that you have as a pastor, negotiation, communication, dealing with all kinds of personalities, leadership in a staff situation, all those things are exactly what you use in any kind of an organization or a business. It's really not that different.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think of why do so many pastors, when they leave a church situation, why do they go into sales position? Just because, sales is just persuasion. It's figuring out how do you communicate value to someone with whatever product or service you're trying to sell. I mean, isn't that really kind of what preaching is? You're communicating value, you're persuading, you're convincing, you're communicating. To me, it's all basically the same thing. It's just in a different context.
Yeah, very well said. So here's a question specifically to ghostwriting. And I'm not asking you to tell me how much you make financially right now, but what could someone expect if there's a pastor out there thinking, man, this sounds interesting. I've got the skill set that I could do that. I think, what's a reasonable salary or amount of income that a pastor could expect as a beginning ghostwriter, maybe as a more experienced ghostwriter? Like what would you say to that?
That's a really good question. And I would say it really does not depend on your writing skills so much as it depends on your networking and marketing skills. And I think success in ghostwriting is not really necessarily just about the writing. It's about who you know and getting connected with the right people who are willing to pay you what you feel like you're worth as a ghostwriter. So, but just to answer specifically your question, I would say a good rate for a very, very beginning ghostwriter for a book project is somewhere probably between $5,000 and $15,000. That's sort of considered like the very, very low end of professional ghostwriting. 5,000 in particular it's really, really low. But I say that with the caveat that you have to start somewhere. We all have to start somewhere. And I think if you're interested in ghostwriting, the first and foremost, most important thing is getting that first book project under your belt. So you can get some experience, you can get a testimonial from a client, you can just figure out what in the heck you're doing, because having not done this before, you have a million questions, but just getting that project under your belt, I think, is really key. And really, once you build it up from there, I mean, I would say the range for professional ghostwriting for professional ghostwriters who've been doing it for a while and have a good track record, I would say a pretty standard rate is somewhere between 40 and 60,000 per book. That's fairly standard. Then it can easily go up from there, depending on who you know and what kind of projects you're doing. If you get into celebrity projects, those obviously could potentially pay higher, but not necessarily. Yeah. You might be surprised at some of the ghostwriting projects that I know about where the writers were not even really paid that much. And the advance for the celebrity was not even that much. So it totally just depends on the project.
Yeah. Well, I've got one other question that I'm going to save for our backstage, but I'll say it now, and you can be thinking about it until we all join up in the backstage area. But it's this: I'm going to ask you if you had maybe just one piece of advice. If you want to throw in a few bonus ones, that's fine as well. But to a pastor who is wanting to get started down this road, if they're interested and they say, "Man, how do I get going here? Where do I start?" What would you say to that pastor that wants to get started in ghostwriting? So don't answer that now. We'll go backstage with that question. But to close this out, unless Les has anything, I was just going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about your podcast and where people can find that and how they can connect with you, and maybe ways that you can serve our audience if they want to reach out.
Sure. So I think I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I have two sides to my business. One is the ghostwriting side, which is kind of the bulk of what I do. The other side of it is where I get to help and train writers. And that is, of course, through my Daily Writer podcast, which is a daily show, as the title suggests. And that show is all about helping writers develop mindset and habits and creativity for success in their writing life, whether they're doing client work or whether they're doing their own books or whatever it is they're doing. And I love doing that show. It's one of the highlights of my week, putting that show together. And I typically do an interview, 1 or 2 interviews per week, and then I do little short episodes during the week typically. And I really, really enjoy that. So I have the podcast, and then I also have a membership community called the Daily Writer Community. And that is where people can come and they can get help and support with their writing goals. It's not really a community where necessarily we all sort of look at each other's writing and evaluate it and that kind of a thing, although that does happen sometimes. But really, it's a community where you can come, and I think of it as the, you guys will remember the show Cheers from the 80s probably, the place where everybody knows your name. You walk in and people are like, Norm, because you walk in the door and everybody there knows who you are. This community is kind of like that, where you come and people know who you are. We know what your goals are, and we know what you're trying to accomplish with your writing. And we support that through weekly writing sprints, which that's where we get on Zoom, just like we're doing now. And we don't work on the stuff together, but we check in and see what our goals are, and we problem solve. And then also we have a guest expert call once a week. Sometimes I do a call. Sometimes I bring in other people to do calls on all kinds of different topics related to writing. But yeah, essentially that's kind of the 2 things that I do, is ghostwriting and the Daily Writer. And then people can find out more about that by going to dailywriterlife.com. And they can find out more about me by going to my personal website, which is kentsanders.net.
Awesome. Well, we will link to those in the show notes. And as you were speaking, I just went and subscribed to your podcast, The Daily Writer.
Oh, cool.
I'm excited to listen to that. So, Kent, it's been a pleasure, man. I'm going to turn it over to Les. Les, you can finish it up in any way you want, my friend.
Yeah, well, I'll just echo what Jon had said in our gratitude, Kent. I really believe that this is so valuable for many people in our community, many listeners, because I know sort of the behind the scenes part of this world as well. Please listen to me now, people. This is something, if you're looking for something that can really make a difference and make an impact in terms of arriving at your goals of, financial freedom, time flexibility in your world, seriously look into ghostwriting or something related to it, because it can really make that big a difference. We've certainly seen that. I've seen it. And Kent, I appreciate you sharing your story and really and truly what an EntrePastor life can look like. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's been totally my pleasure.
Well, hey, thanks for watching this episode of the EntrePastors podcast. Make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can be notified every time we release a new episode. If you'd like to get connected to other pastors who are learning to think, act, and thrive as prosperous entrepreneurs, then we invite you to check us out on Facebook. Just search for the EntrePastors Connect group, answer a few of our simple questions there, and we'd love to include you in the conversations. And if you're really ready to go to the next level, then we invite you to join our EntrePastors membership community. When you become a monthly subscriber, you will receive access to courses, exclusive community, and coaching that will help you along in your own EntrePastors journey. If there's anything else we can do to serve you, please visit us at EntrePastors.com, and we will do our best to serve you there. God bless everybody. See you soon.